This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is a professor. His name is Doug Stokes. His book, Against Decolonisation, Campus Culture Wars and the Decline of the West. Right in my wheelhouse, my kind of guy. I got to tell you, this is one of these conversations you want to go read, because Doug is using an efficiency of words to describe such complex crap in society, and he does it in a brilliant way. Without any further delay from me, let's jump right in. Talk these culture wars with Doug Stokes. I hope you enjoy. I'm going to go straight to the deep end, Doug, which is, as I survey the landscape, and I'll use DEI as a shorthand for all of this insanity that's unfolding, I'll take a piece of language from you when you start to talk about the civilizational logic. I guess that's where I'm at. What is the civilizational logic as we continue down this rabbit hole? Because at some stage of the game, the people that are being penalized by the DEI, which I would probably argue often are the producers, at some stage they say, and this might sound like an old Ayn Rand trope, but at some stage they might just say, you know what, Galt's Gulch sounds better than this. It seems like the civilizational logic is the point where we're at.
Yeah, I think so. I think that where a lot of this DEI comes from is it comes from deeper philosophical currents. It's like deep philosophical currents meet institutional bureaucracies, meet power players, meet a broader collapse in moral authority, and institutional confidence, and Western civilizational confidence. You have to go back a bit. The philosophical root of a lot of this stuff in DEI comes from developments, in particular in French social theory, postmodernism, poststructuralism. I'm sure you've heard of these terms. But if you want to boil it down to a specific, fairly simple to understand theoretical logic, these theories articulate what's called social constructivism. What this essentially says is that there's no such thing as the real world. There's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as science or objectivity. Everything is ultimately socially constructed into subjective basis by social actors, human beings. It draws on a Foucauldian, almost a Nietzschean logic as well, but people like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, in the decolonial, post-colonial sense, people like Edward Said. And so they articulate this idea that there's no such thing as science, objectivity, or truth. Everything's ultimately about intersubjective discourses and epistemes. And when you have that approach to things, human life, human interaction is characterized by endless sets of power plays for one group to impose their truth on another group. If we have no process of rational adjudication, if we completely abandon ontology, i.e. what actually exists, a notion of objectivity, everything therefore becomes a Nietzschean intersubjective power play of one group imposing their truth onto another group. And through that process of imposition, you almost conjure the world into being. You make the world through that process of imposition. So you can begin to see how this then translates into this idea of colonizer, colonized. So Derrida talks about this idea of binaries. He says that at the heart of Western civilization are these philosophical binaries: black, white, man, woman, white, black, rational, irrational, civilized, uncivilized. And these binaries ultimately operate at the heart of Western civilization. And within this dyad is always one privileged part of the binary that then imposes itself on the underprivileged part. So what social constructivists want to do is to expose the contingent and arbitrary nature of human knowledge and then flip that script.
Here's the thing, you lay it out. I was actually thinking before I started talking to you, I was like, man, Doug's going to summarize this in 2 minutes. It's going to be impenetrable. It can't be argued with. And I'm thinking, well, gosh, what are we going to talk about for 60 minutes? Because I'm on the same page. Here's really where I'm at, which is if what you just said is true, and it is, I'm being binary, it's true. So then I'm at the point where, let's just for shorthand call them the DEI team. I don't have any other place to put this. As a kid who a long time ago did 12 years of Catholic school, this shit's all evil. That's all I can put it at is evil. And so then ultimately, I'm Gen X. Me, my friends, my associates, we talk, especially amongst men. Most women that I know in America, for example, don't seem to understand this. I spend most of my time in Asia. A lot of Asian women do seem to understand this. The conversation that I have with most men these days is two things. When will the implosion happen? And if the implosion doesn't happen, when will the fight happen?
This is interesting. I was just doing some reading for the last couple of weeks about civilizational collapse. You don't necessarily have a key implosion or inflection point. You look at the Roman Empire, for example, or the Western Roman Empire, it didn't end in a bang. If you look at it, it collapsed over a period of about 600 years. What will be signs of that? Well, things begin to gum up. Inflation begins to build, supply chains become more fraught, the quality of life and services begins to go down. I don't think that there's necessarily a key inflection point. It could be a death of 1,000 cuts. And so to go back to your original question in terms of the civilizational logic here, if we think about what sits at the heart of Western civilization, or especially in its inflection post-Enlightenment, there has been this emphasis on objectivity, rational adjudication of various truth claims to ultimately identify what has a higher purchase on what actually exists, which is always in a process of iteration, but nonetheless can help to advance human society, civil, medicine, scientific breakthroughs, etc. Accompanying that are processes whereby you ultimately take on the best people to perform those tasks. So in other words, merit-based. So you bring in the best person to do the task, to design the Boeing jets, or to serve in the Navy, or to do whatever.
To be clear, the DEI side doesn't care about merit clearly at all.
Lots of these ideologues say that an emphasis on merit is in fact a smokescreen for white supremacy. So they see that emphasis on merit.
And I would have to ask you, though, because I think this is one of the responses that I've seen. I don't even know what the hell white supremacy means. I'm 50% Lithuanian. Is there a Lithuanian supremacy? Is there a Zimbabwe supremacy? It's all nonsense.
Yeah. Well, this is the other thing as well. So essentially, if you want to really go down the rabbit hole on this, essentially at the heart of this DEI cult, this new religion that we have, there are a number of claims. The first claim really is that there is essentially post facto rationalization. How do you prove white supremacy? Well, you prove white supremacy through differential outcomes for various groups, or racial groups, or gender groups, or sexual groups, differential outcomes, but only negative differential outcomes. What you say, there's a differential outcome here between white and black, and therefore the blacks get less, and therefore it proves a system of systemic racism and white supremacy. Now, what that actually does is not only does it lump all black people, which is a very from Nigeria to Zimbabwe to Jamaica, it's a very diverse population that itself does a violence to it. But what it ultimately does, it undermines the different inputs into those outcomes. Number one, it says that there's a differential outcome because of the color of their skin. It's not because of cultural variables or human agency or human dignity or how hard they've worked, etc. So essentially, it reinforces systemic conspiracy theory, constantly reinforcing a systemic conspiracy theory. But the second thing it does is it completely ignores positive outcomes for ethnic minority groups. So, for example, in the UK, if you look at the data, some of the highest educational and financial outcomes go to East Asians and Indians. They tend to do much better at university, come out with higher levels of degrees. They go into the workforce and they earn more money than the white majority. So rather than saying, well, there are these ethnic minorities to sustain the argument for white supremacy, what we're going to do is we're going to ignore all the better outcomes for these ethnic minority groups, not look at those at all, and just focus on this one group here, ignore a lot of positive outcomes for this group. So if you look at, for example, in the UK, people from black African heritage, higher educational outcomes, they exclude from school at a much lower rate than those from black Caribbean backgrounds. In fact, the black African heritage kids do better at school than the white majority. But even that, they don't even disaggregate that data. So essentially, The key argument that they tend to make is we have to find a negative outcome somewhere. And then rather than interrogating the variables that may go into that production of that negative outcome, we'll ignore it and collapse our narrative into an explanation, a catch-all systemic conspiracy called white supremacy.
It's insane. You use the phrase color of skin. This is what I'm going to say. I guess some people get itchy, but I would assume that most young kids, if you were to ask them, once they start to understand life, what grade they would get to, they would start to understand, especially if you're a young kid and you meet your friends' parents and stuff. And then you also know a kid that maybe came from a more disadvantaged place and he studies his ass off. But it seems like we've lost the ability to acknowledge and to say openly that outcomes come from an assortment of places, not just cultural or not just environmental. The parents and the gene pool have something to do with it. Now, I'm not assigning any percentages. I don't know what they are, but I think it's become a very odd situation where we are not allowed to acknowledge and say openly. I mean, because look, having lived in Asia for 10 years, clearly you could probably take kids from a disadvantaged countryside home in Asia in various places and give them schooling, and these kids are going to just excel. And that's not necessarily the case with all groups around the world. So do you find it interesting that the genetic part of this outcome is not allowed to be discussed?
I'm not an expert on that area, but there are obviously different variables that one has to consider when you're looking at these differential outcomes. One would be obviously you're moving toward the arguments about IQ and stuff like that.
Well, I'm just saying that for any kind of outcome, there's going to be many factors. Environmental and genetic would be the starting two.
So environmental, genetic, familial structure, broader cultural expectations. In other words, so independently of where you put the weight on the scale and those various explanations, the key meta takeaway point here is that the DEI cult and the commissars within our institutions commit or carry out what's called a univariate analysis. So a univariate analysis basically says we have this social phenomena, in their case, a differential outcome, racially coded or sexually coded or whatever. There's one variable that explains that, white supremacy or systemic racism or institutional cultures, institutional racism, etc.
They love that because they can rally their troops around that so easily. And then it just becomes, okay, everyone's a white supremacist and it's a big power grab.
Well, absolutely. But it makes me really quite angry about that, is it's such sloppy science insofar as I don't know anybody who is half a brain would say, well, we've got this phenomena, rather than conducting what's called a multivariate analysis, i.e. you control for the variables that may have gone into the production of that outcome. So if you make a cake and it doesn't rise, you keep doing it over and over again, you keep saying, it's because I've only used one egg. Well, that's stupid. You may have needed to use 3 eggs, of course, but it's the temperature of the oven, it's the ingredients you use plain flour, so the self-raising flour. In other words, even just making a cake and it goes wrong, or anything goes wrong in your life, you conduct a multivariate analysis on an individual level as to how you explain the outcome that you don't wish to produce. But these people don't do that. The DEI cult and the commissars, they operate on a univariate analysis. Now, what gets me pissed off the most is that we are so weak, in the Anglophone West in particular, we'd allow that to take place. It's such sloppy thinking. It's so sloppy. Now, this doesn't deny there's a history of racism. It's not denying that racism doesn't exist.
I got to push back a little bit. Where is the racism? What is the racism exactly? I'm not in charge of every one of the kids in Baltimore and Chicago that were not able to pass their math and science and reading classes. I'm not in charge of that. What is the racism exactly? In fact, in America, as used as an example, let's be honest, there's not exactly a lot of interracial marriages. There's not a lot of interaction. Look, I grew up in the Northern Virginia area outside DC. These areas are fairly segregated. Let's just be frank. I just keep wondering, what is the racism? And then every time I'm told that there's some racism, we got a Jussie Smollett doing something in Chicago. It seems like there's a lot of engineered racism. It just strikes me. When you said that, I feel like it's almost, when we want to argue against this stuff, we have to have all these disclaimers put in place. Whereas I've reached the point where I'm tired of disclaimers.
I think the way you feel is quite common. I think we are now seeing, last year, it's even clearer. I think people have moved beyond this stuff now and are just completely sick of it. because the left and the progressives and the DEI cult really put this on steroids in 2020 onwards. The Biden administration, the tech Silicon Valley, they've really put this on steroids. And there's been sort of various moments that have really swung the narrative back. I think obviously Elon Musk's taking over X has been big. You realize how big Twitter has been in this process.
Sure. The whole Harvard situation has been amazing to watch that unfold.
Absolutely. But to go back to your point, I think it would be a mistake to say that racism doesn't exist. But the problem is that essentially you may get individual instances of racism, but what then happens is you may get somebody using the N-word or being a racist or even the cracker. This is the irony. If you look at the data in America, which I do in the book, the much higher incidences of racism are basically committed by black people.
Shit, DEI is racism.
It is complete racism in the casual anti-white racism and anti-Asian racism. The anti-Semitism you see in it too. That's become increasingly much clearer. The settler colonial critique has really become very, very clear. So the scales have really fallen from people's eyes. But I think to go back to the meta point here, and that is somebody will say something racist, but then what happens, that then gets coded again into this systemic argument. So essentially you may get one individual somewhere says something, and it's proof then of this underlying system of discrimination, which is essentially conspiratorial thinking. It's complete conspiracy theory thinking. And it's just not borne out by the evidence. If you look at the actual data.
I think we're reaching the point, though, it's water off the duck's back in the sense that if somebody says that to me, look, and I have conversations with progressive professors on this podcast, and many times they've brought up the George Floyd case. And I'll say, well, hold on. I had a Memphis community leader on this podcast, and we talked about the black guy that was killed by 6 black cops. And I said, people in Vietnam, where I'm at right now, they all know about George Floyd because the media industrial complex informed the entire world about it. But I said, they did not inform anybody about the Memphis situation. It's the most interesting thing how the progressive academics handled it. When I bring this contrast up, this comp up, they just go, oh, I don't care. So what? And they just move on.
It's coded as part of a narrative. So there's a couple of things I could say there. Number one, in the book, I talk about a guy called, I think his name was Tony Timper or Tiny Timper or something like that. The white guy was killed in exactly the same circumstances as George Floyd. Nobody knows his name because he was white. That then goes to a really interesting argument as to why this stuff was put on steroids. And I think the reason this stuff was put on steroids was because of Trump derangement syndrome. Trump got in, and I think it was part of the influence and psychological operation of the Democrats and the Democratic-aligned media to really push this stuff. Trump is a white supremacist, he's a racist, he's this, he's that, he's the demon. And then you really saw this kick out and really take on a very, very powerful narrative. So it's clearly a very strong part of the power. I mean, in 2019, the year before George Floyd was killed, you look at the actual stats of police black interactions. People are asked, how many black men did the police kill in 2019? 2,000, 3,000, 4,000? Turns out, basically, it's 19 unarmed black men were killed by the police across the entire America.
Doug, I've had academic professors come on here and say it's like 10,000 plus. I just say, you come on, that's a lie. That is not true. Like, no, you don't understand the data. And it's insanity.
That is the data. But then if you go down the rabbit hole even more, again, this is all easily available on the Department of Justice, the FBI website. 19 unarmed black men were killed by cops across the entirety of America in 2019. 19 were killed. Each 19 is tragic, no doubt about that, but it's statistically insignificant, frankly. But then you look at police-felon interactions. Again, black criminals are responsible for the vast majority on a per capita demographic basis of murder of police in any other race. Again, you look at the murder stats. This is, again, it's a non-controversial point. Anybody can check this. I think the black population in America is 13%. So you split it down the middle on a sex basis. 7% of young black men commit, I think it's now over 50% of all murders across America.
Yeah, it's 60. And if you think about it, too, if the black population in America is 13%, so 6.5%, essentially 3-point-something% of the U.S. population does 60% of homicides.
It's obviously gone up then. Not tragedy per se, but mostly young black men are killing young black men. So this is the game. This then also feeds into this thing when progressives argue, well, we've got to defund the police, we have to have this policing.
If two white guys right now have a conversation where we talk about these statistics, we are by definition racist. If we even talk about the statistics, because I've done this on this podcast so many times, and this sheer act of acknowledging the statistics means I'm a bad guy.
I think that's deeply fallacious and wrong and also immoral, because I think if you want to ultimately turn those terrible statistics around of very, very high criminality, but also murder rates of young black men, you have to look reality in the face. My thinking has been formed very, very heavily by somebody like Shelby Steele, a leading African-American intellectual. He talks about white guilt and black liberals and the effect that this has had on the black community in the States. He's a very, very sharp thinker. He castigates these liberal narratives that essentially give a free pass, erase the agency, erase the free choices and the personal responsibility of large sections of the American population, to collapse it into a systemic conspiracy, which then allows these terrible and tragic phenomena to keep going on and on. So we either acknowledge and look reality in the face to try and turn this around, or we essentially accept the kind of DEI cult, commissar, progressive narrative, and this stuff won't go away. You're going to have more dead black men.
I'm past you. It's not turning around. I don't really believe you think it's turning around. I don't think it's going to turn around. We're going to reach something, like you said, back to the Roman Empire. It's either going to be the slow, gradual, we're in the lobster in the pot boiling and we don't feel it, and then one day it's just all over, or there's going to be some conflict.
This is the worry. I looked at some polling piece yesterday, I think I tweeted it, about I think it was the Brookings, maybe it was, a polling as to what they think the biggest threats to American security was going forward. And remarkably, a lot of it was all about the results of the 2024 election and the potentiality for civil war or some kind of big domestic disturbance in the US.
Some of them were bad people, but mostly the unarmed protesters that were walking into the Capitol were somehow or another going to take control of the American military and the nuke secrets, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's all out there. I want to take you to an example because you've got such a great perspective on this and you're very deep on it. But it's an example that I would go back in time. And I think for me, it starts with, frankly, Bruce Jenner. When he transitioned, that felt like the launch to me. And I think this was in 2015. But shortly thereafter, within a couple of years, I had never in my entire life, never had these conversations about gender at all. Then all of a sudden, we have to. And I remember that New York announced that they had legally recognized 31 genders. I thought to myself, well, that's unusual. And then there was penalties associated with these genders in the sense that I think if you were a business and somebody told you they're one of these 31 genders and you didn't recognize it, you could be penalized, fined. And I thought, well, gosh, if you took a room full of kids, you sat them down, you said, okay, listen, kids, there's 31 genders. And of course, there's no scientific basis to any of these 31 genders. They were clearly made up out of whole cloth. But if you sat a group of kids down in a room, let's say 12-year-olds and 50 of them, and you said, guys, there's 31 genders in New York. How many kids in that room would say, why aren't there 32? Why aren't there 7.5 billion genders? Where are we right now in terms of the mass brainwashing to where kids would not even think to say, where the F did the 31 come from? I have a theory where the 31 came from, by the way. Baskin Robbins ice cream in America is famous for 31 flavors.
I think you might be right. The Ben and Jerry's theory of gender ideology. I like that. I might have to steal that, my friend.
Where do you think we are in terms of the kids, though? If there was 50 kids were in the room, 12-year-olds, and they're told there's 31 genders in New York, do you think we're at the critical thinking where kids would wonder why it's not 32 or 37 or 50 or a billion?
Potentially. This goes to something even more pernicious, which is the potential brainwashing of children. I'm not a gender critical or transsexual gender dysphoria expert at all, but in the UK, we're really seeing really clear evidence now of the irreversible effects of this ideology on children. So from the incision and removal of breast tissue, puberty blockers for children under the age of 18, which has incredible long-term effects. The Tavistock Clinic was a really famous clinic. It's been closed down now. I'm hoping there'll be some legal prosecutions because it put children on irreversible puberty blockers, which has massive long-term hormonal effects, physical effects too, in terms of never go through puberty. So we're seeing the effects of this stuff now begin to emerge. I'll swing it around a bit in terms of the bigger picture here. This does also go back to the social constructivism I spoke to you about at the very early point of our conversation. A lot of this stuff about gender is directly emergent from that postmodernist, post-colonial, social constructivist queer theory, people like Judith Butler. If there's no such thing as reality, i.e. biological reality, hormones, if there's no such thing as reality, everything by its very nature is definitional. I can define and become who I am. and I am what I am, and I am what I say I am, rather than being constrained by reality. So that sex-gender debate is directly cannibalistic and springboards from that deeper switch in Western culture, in particular in the universities, away from science and objectivity and the material basis of reality. This more self-definitional, social constructivist. There's no such thing as reality. Reality is what I say it is. So if I say I'm a unicorn, I am a unicorn. If I say I'm a demigod or demigender or whatever it is, that is who I am. But where it goes badly wrong is when people assert they have this identity, when it's then picked up by institutional cultures and then recoded through forms of legal innovation. So essentially, Christopher Caldwell in the American context did some fantastic work on the civil rights legislation, how effectively you have a secondary constitution now. In the UK, in this legal value nexus, we have what's called the Equality Act, which was passed by the Labour government, the socialist government in 2010, and the so-called conservatives left this thing alone. So that then encodes a lot of this legal warfare, this legal innovation that you see, which therefore makes people very scared to go near it, to challenge these ideas.
The oppressor-oppressed logic, this colonial mindset, these arguments that are put out there. The one thing that I've enjoyed being in Asia is to watch, to witness. Okay, at one point in time, UK had their thumb on China. At one point in time, France and America had their thumb on Vietnam. I give credit to these populations that at that moment in time in their histories, the greatest asset they had were people. They had huge numbers of people. They basically said, we are going to get rid of you. We're going to get rid of you. We're behind the eight ball right now. Okay, great for you. You came over here and you got us at this moment in time, but we're going to get rid of you. And they did. They have gone ahead and turned their civilizations, essentially, their economies, their cities, their countries into just boom houses. When you start to contrast that, so I find Asia the most interesting aspect because Asia is the one that's left out of especially the American conversation. America purposefully keeps things at white and black because if you introduce Asia into the American conversation, the whole narrative just falls down. I just find it amazing that we can watch Asia pull themselves up by their bootstraps, solve their problems, fix their situations through a combination of their families, the environmental, and clearly genes. They've done it.
This goes to the tragedy of these DEI narratives. If you look at the GDP data, China in the 60s was at a lower GDP than sub-Saharan Africa. And look at China today. I suspect Vietnam would have been
same thing.
Cleaning up a major war by the world's preeminent superpower, most powerful military in human history.
And to dig out of that, amazing.
To turn it around. And then you get the South Vietnamese, the Bo people that fled Vietnam and went to the United States, didn't speak the language, were desperately poor, and have turned it around. I suspect the Vietnamese and a lot of the East Asian refugees, the Vietnamese in particular, are most probably very, very successful minorities now in the American context.
If you take it a step further, too, even a couple decades before, Korean success in America is off the hook.
Therefore, then, you have almost a perfect petri dish. You've got people that don't speak the lingo, don't speak English, aren't culturated, come there with certain sets of values to apply themselves, and within a generation are invariably running businesses. They've got their kids in Harvard or top Ivy League universities. They're doing very, very well. So then how did they do that? Well, how they did that was different explanations as to how they've done that. But one presumes on a cultural level, how you do that is through an iron will, self-discipline, not indulging in self-pity. Oh, my country's been bombed by the Americans, therefore the American government owes me money. White people owe me money. And this is what Shelby Steele says and Thomas Sowell say. If you adopt that mentality that somehow the system owes you, somebody else has got to give you money or give you some special dispensation because of the color of your skin, you're going to go nowhere. These DEI cultists and the commissars and like that, if you look at a lot of left-wing politics, progressive politics, It operates on the principle of ethnic corralling. What it wants to do is it wants to create political plantations where you've got various ethnic minorities that will get a special dispensational handout from whoever's in power or the bureaucracy in power, and therefore they'll put their votes down on the paper to keep the show on the road. Now, that's a recipe for civilizational disaster.
Let me frame it this way. There are groups, there are populations that can't do it or won't do it, and their leaders know it. And that's where we really are. Okay, because, for example, in America, the bureaucracy, okay, we throw all this money at education. For example, if I was to take young Black kids, their educational outcomes are worse than the 60s, worse than the 50s. Well, why is that? No, because no one cares. No one cares anymore because there's this safety net that is just there. I don't think we really know if the safety net is preventing success or there is no better outcome than that.
Thomas Sowell, I'm sure you're familiar with, is a giant, an African-American giant, but because he's a conservative, he's not really spoken about. And he's one of the most published authors. He's done some fantastic work on this, and he's often on the Hoover Institution website, talks a lot. He's fantastic, really, really sharp. He put some really counterintuitive facts out there that shocked even me. He said, for example, there was a larger Black middle class in the 20s and 30s than there is today. And also, marriage was much higher amongst the Black population and amongst the white population.
You know, you can cut to the chase. LBJ screwed everybody over.
That's what he basically says. He says these massive welfare programs replaced the Black family structure and undercut a lot of that stuff. If you think about how society operates on a sort of structure agency basis. You have certain sets of social incentivizations towards some sort of behavior. And if you essentially subsidize a massive population, you take away the drive, the structural conditions that will drive them down the right path. That's the kind of argument Thomas Sowell makes as well.
I don't know who's got the right pronunciation. I would say probably Thomas Sowell. He passed on, but I had an economist on this podcast several times from George Mason University, Black economist named Walter Williams. Him and Sowell were buddies. You probably had seen Walter Williams over the years. He is great. He's in the same exact headspace as Steele and Sowell.
Yeah. When you listen to that, it captures something quite powerful.
Let me push you on this sense in our limited time here. We know all this, and they know all this. The progressives know this. The DEI cultists know this. They all know this. They don't give a shit. This is about a power grab. They don't care. I saw the headline today that the FAA is working to make sure they can bring people in that have severe psychiatric disabilities to the FAA. And my friends were like, well, that doesn't make any sense. I was on some thread. I was like, yeah, it makes perfect sense. This is a buck break thing. This is a demoralization thing. This is to demoralize good people. That's where we're at right now. It's all about demoralizing.
Yeah, it's about moral disarmament. It's about essentially demoralization and moral disarmament through guilt tripping. And it's all about power to maintain these forms of institutional and political power. But the problem with this is this. We are in a very different international system now, where America has been the global hegemon. We are now in a multipolar international system where you obviously have the rise of East Asia. I mean, you're in Vietnam, you know all about that. So you have the rise of East Asia. China's become very strong, both economically and militarily. It looks like Russia now is going to do much better in Ukraine than people thought. We've got the Hamas-Israel thing. We've got the Houthis. So essentially, we are in a more multipolar international system where the costs to America itself, the cost-benefit analysis of its hegemonic leadership is far less clear. We had the globalization period of economic interdependence. Now we've got increasingly more deglobalization. FDI now is moving out of China quite heavily, friendshoring, onshoring, and national security concerns around critical supply minerals.
American values are not respected. When somebody like Putin can say America's woke and half the world knows exactly what that means. When the Ukraine war started, so many Americans, so much American political, the names, the media, etc. Oh, Russia's a paper tiger. It's all going to fall. And here we are a couple years later, and it was all just nonsense.
You've got all that going on. So the cost to America's hegemonic leadership is going up. You're seeing it now even with the Houthi rebels. So he had world trade passing through that strait onto Egypt. Who's doing it? The US and the UK. China's nowhere to be seen, but it affects China's interests. The costs of that form of hegemonic leadership, the costs to the United States of solving global collective action problems are going up. But then it gets also interesting on this level insofar as What sustains a civilization? It has to be, to quite a large extent, internal narrative. Now, you're seeing the same in the UK. It's very, very hard now to recruit for the American military. You're seeing exactly the same phenomenon now in the UK. People don't want to go into the military anymore. There's that sense of, what's the point? Our country hates us. We're castigated. We're seen as wrong. Also, the broader civilizational logic, when you aggregate this at a civilization or a social level, all of those decision-making processes subordinate to intersectional theory and DEI, i.e., we're not going to take the best person, we're not going to take the most competent person, we're going to take this person here because of the color of their skin, their sexuality, how they identify. When you aggregate that out at a societal level, those decision-making processes will have a disastrous effect because you're no longer getting the best people who can do the job. And our generation, or perhaps the Gen Xers, are very different to what's coming up now. The boomers are dying out. We're next. So it's like, what's going to happen when you have this hardwired cultural intersectionality where feelings over facts, identity over reality, and that is cascaded throughout America's social institutions, business, etc. That is disastrous. Now, if you think about this in the context of world order and rising multipolarity, what ultimately makes a great power is both a belief in itself, a degree of civilizational confidence, but also getting the best people in, making sure that when you're designing airplanes and computers and AIs, you've got the best people doing that. They're not there because of the color of their skin or how they identify. So that really is a recipe for civilizational suicide.
But the problem with the best people in comment, what you are essentially saying is that another group of people were not capable. They didn't build all those Gothic cathedrals around Europe. They didn't do that. So the best people in means that there is a group that's not the best people. And that's where we're at. Because the people that are not the best people have realized they can group together and they're a power. And now they've got the bureaucracy.
That's how ultimately you go down the tubes. The same in the Soviet Union, where it's about who controls the bureaucracies. And you tend to get the mediocre players, but then it becomes about a power play. So the bureaucracy exists for itself. The bureaucracy is no longer there to produce a societal outcome that's optimized for the preservation of American civilization. It's there. The bureaucracy simply exists for the bureaucrats and the power plays within that and the well-being of the employees. And then what's the error correction? If you think about it on a systemic level, what are the error correction mechanisms? And we have in a marketplace, if you make bad sandwiches, I'm not going to buy your sandwich. I don't want to buy your sandwiches. They're shit. Excuse my language. I shouldn't swear. But they're no good. I'm going to go somewhere else.
I'll beep your swearing if you want.
It's up to you.
I don't beep mine.
Well, if you don't beep yours, it don't beep mine. Let's be equal here. So essentially, a functional market will exert some discipline on the societal actors within it. If you make crap sandwiches, I'm not going to buy this. I'm going to go elsewhere. So you go under. It's brutal, but that's the reality of it. We all benefit from that because we're going to get better sandwiches, competition. If you think about this on an institutional level, especially in the public sector, or even crony capitalism, when you get massive mega multinational corporations that just suck the government teat all the time, there is very, very little discipline of those closed loop systems. My experience of any bureaucracy, when a bureaucracy goes wrong, nobody gets fired. And how do they error correct? They don't. They just grow the bureaucracy. They put more bureaucrats in.
To add, growing up in the D.C. area, 6 of the top 10 wealthiest counties in America surround Washington, D.C.
Yeah, there you go.
I know what that vibe is. And what's amazing, too, is a piece of land with a crap house and 16,000 square foot of land would have cost you $200,000 or $300,000 in 1995 is now $3 million. What people don't understand what has happened with the American bureaucracy is that they're voting for their jobs.
Of course they are.
They're in on the scam. And I tell you right now, too, if one spends their life clocking in, getting paid because you've figured out the angle, you figured out where you could get paid, you really don't do shit, you're not important, you could be replaced in 2 seconds, this is how you've got the couple $1 million house and all this other stuff. And this is what's been pulled over on people. Most Americans still don't understand how much that has transpired, the I'm voting for my job.
Yeah, that's the problem. In an age of plenty, you can get away with a lot of fat. But if we are entering into an era of great power competition, much more civilizational competition or the rising China, do you think China would entertain any of these ideas, these DEI ideas for a second?
No, none of it.
You look at their history, the way that they work their children, the education.
Conservative America has been dealt a piece of propaganda as well, because conservative America, if they were to go and if there was some language compatibility and when they were to go to China, they would realize, oh my gosh, these people are on the same page as me. They think like me.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the problem. You have these closed loop bureaucracies, these more crony cartel type systems in the market. Then when it gets really dangerous and very pernicious is when you get the capture of these public sector institutions by these ideologues.
It's been amazing to watch Musk fight back. It's quite unexpected because now X, Twitter had become something that was just, it made me feel like taking a shower if I even looked at it, how it operated in the way that Musk has gone in there. People can come up with any reason they want for why they hate one of the most successful entrepreneurs to ever live. They can come up with whatever reason, but for him to recreate the town square in spite of all of the shots coming at him is an amazing achievement.
Yeah, I agree. I think that him taking Twitter over now, X, it really makes you realize the power of social media. Therefore, the power that a really tiny bit of real estate in California, the tech Silicon Valley, really has in terms of shaping not just Americans' public consciousness, but the public consciousness of the world. That was really clear with the George Floyd event in terms of the shaping public consciousness.
It was an absolute operation in the sense that someone pressed the button, and when the button was pressed, things went into action. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, here we are. It's actually quite amazing, the system that they have of control and dissemination to get the zombie populations just doing whatever the hell they want. It's an amazing achievement.
Yeah, and you saw also the same in the COVID pandemic. I'm not going down COVID conspiracies here, but you saw in the UK, it's the imposition of lockdowns and how quickly that switched around in terms of WHO, the narratives that are coming out of supranational organizations, how that impacted upon politics of the West. It was remarkable in the shaping of public consciousness.
We could talk forever. You have great stuff. Hopefully we can talk again. Hopefully you've enjoyed this banter back and forth. You're a good guy to push on because I'm at a cursory level to some degree, but I can really push on you. You've done the deep dive. I think ultimately the big picture thought is what happens, because it does have this gut level feel that something will come along that will, like I said, either conflict or implosion. It just has that gut level feel. The book, and there's many books, but the book Against Decolonisation, Campus Culture Wars and the Decline of the West. The Harvard thing must have been a great eye-opener for you.
It was really, yeah, to see that unfold. I'm hopeful on that level about the DEI stuff. I hope it now gets chased out more because it's so illiberal. It's so antithetical to human dignity.
It's become a jobs program too.
Absolutely. I know.
Hey, Doug, where can we send people? Again, the book, they can get that on Amazon, other books. Where's the best place to find you?
The only social media I really ever use is Twitter. So they can find me on Twitter at ProfDWS, at ProfDWS.
Doug, again, I appreciate that you have spent your life diving in this hole. And even if people go back and listen to the beginning of this episode, what you said just in the first couple minutes, if people just write it down and go reread it, it's like you're defining the whole damn thing. And it's impenetrable. To thinking smart people, it's impenetrable. Only people that are bad actors will have an argument against it.
Yeah, exactly. What can I say? I agree.
I hope I wasn't too intense for you.
No, it's fantastic, Mike. Absolute real pleasure. And I'll do it again anytime.
Okay, man. Hey, take care. I appreciate it, Doug.
Thank you, buddy. Take care. Cheers.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.